Hello. A few of you guys have sent me this, reacting to Gen Z communists and socialists on TikTok. Now, if you listen to the deprogram, you'd know that I'm a hopeless boomer that doesn't and refuses to use TikTok, but apparently there's quite a bit of lefty content on there. I don't know who this person is, but seeing that she has a Rumble account, basically just another alt-right refugee platform, mentioned in the description box of this video, it's safe to say that she probably has some interesting opinions. Her channel description does state that she wants to defend free speech, after all. A quick look at the video thumbnails and titles quickly shows that she's just another iteration of the usual woke, cringe compilation, try not to laugh challenge, the whites are in danger. Don't bother this person, but listening to just a few minutes will make you quickly realize what kind of intentionally dishonest type we're dealing with. Side note, a defense of socialism will be presented, but that doesn't mean mistakes weren't made in earlier application. This person is making an ideological video not based in facts, but instead in blanket statements, and a lot of lying, you'll see quickly, hence a lot of debunking. A deeper discussion of nuance could have been had, but this person, as you'll very clearly see, isn't interested in any of that, because otherwise, I'd be more than glad to have it.
So today I wanted to take a look at some of the craziness going on. There are a lot of communists and socialists on TikTok. I want to take a look at those. And also I want to review some communism slogans, which I think are very important to realize just how flawed the ideology is. And yeah.
Why do you people send me these things? I can already tell it'll be a lot of out-of-context stuff, the usual cringe, woke, crazy people that doesn't in any way represent the Marxian or socialist left, and probably a lot of liberals that this person interprets as socialists because the American educational system is a joke.
The fact that we're having so many people in Gen Z identifying as socialists and communists shows just how much we failed teaching students the dangers of communism and socialism.
No, the reason many younger people are identifying as socialist, whether they mean actual socialism or social democracy, is because they live under capitalism and see that it isn't working for them, contrary to the propaganda they're fed daily. Stagnant real wages despite skyrocketing productivity, most Americans can't afford a $500 emergency, people are drowning in student and other debt for a job market that makes it basically mandatory to have a degree. There is no place in the US where minimum wage workers, of which over 55% are 25 and up, can afford rent, and nearly half of Americans don't earn enough to afford even a one-bedroom rental. Inflation is destroying savings and making any likelihood of ever owning something an actual fantasy. Infrastructure is crumbling, widening income inequality, climate catastrophe, the American government supporting every fascist tyrant and every dictator. I could go on and on. It isn't young kids not knowing any better, which is frankly a pathetic and infantilizing excuse. It's a natural consequence of them living in the system day in and day out. Furthermore, the American educational system, along with practically the entire base of American media, is explicitly anti-communist, and American students learn nothing but how supposedly horrible communism is. If, in spite of this torrent of propaganda, people still start to look for alternatives, well, maybe the system you're supporting isn't this great thing you're painting it out to be. At least be open to dialogue.
And just how many people were starved to death.
Famine is more a characteristic of capitalism than socialism. Every single famine that occurred in socialist countries was the last famine in countries that otherwise were plagued with famine for centuries, if not millennia. In fact, capitalism kills far more in sheer numbers and scale as a direct result of famine every few years than socialism supposedly did, remember the numbers are very sketchy, in its entire history. Socialism has been empirically proven to provide a higher quality of life at equal levels of economic development, and the data is clear in that all socialist countries would provide at least 100% of the caloric requirements for their populations, unlike capitalist countries. To quote the literal CIA, the Soviet Union's ability to live without imports is much greater than that of most, possibly all, other industrialized economies. American and Soviet citizens eat about the same amount of food each day, but the Soviet diet may be more nutritious. If you're gonna play the "but those capitalist countries were underdeveloped" card, well, that was equally true of those socialist countries, and they had to deal with even worse as they were sanctioned, embargoed, invaded, sabotaged, etc., etc., from their very inception. That's not even mentioning food banks in developed capitalist countries. Not to mention also that underdevelopment was actually a symptom of overexploitation as a direct result of capitalism. Please read a book. There's several on the screen now.
And the mass murder of millions of people.
Very rich pointing a finger at someone living in and praising the capitalist system. Just as the previous point, capitalism has been responsible for far more human suffering and death than socialism ever has, but the criteria are different when you bring that up because it isn't ideologically convenient. Where are your crocodile tears for the victims of capitalism by the bullet in Iraq, Vietnam, or Afghanistan? by the loan in Senegal, Peru, or Somalia, by colonialism in Algeria, Brazil, or India. Oh, right. Not ideologically convenient, so the goalposts move. She might be ignorant or dishonest enough, I don't know which is worse, to claim those weren't the result of capitalism. Well, in that case, she'll believe just about anything. Read Killing Hope and the Triumph of Evil. By the way, a neat and very messed up tidbit is that many of those millions that were killed under socialism were either Soviet citizens killed by Nazi Germany during World War II, or literal Nazis killed on the Eastern Front during wartime. These are counted as genuine victims of communism, and if you want a deeper dive into other ridiculous ways these ghouls go about inflating numbers, like for example counting non-births by extrapolating fertility data, take a look at this video here.
I mean, take a look at the Soviet Union, for example. When they were a socialist society, 18 million people were incarcerated in the Gulag.
Oh, thank God, I thought she was going to say Vuvuzela. First of all, she's lying through ignorance here, which was already made clear before, but I'm having fun making fun of her, so let's do this. She literally googled Soviet Gulag how many, and 18 million was spat out. At no point were 18 million concurrent people, which would have been nearly 12% of the entire Soviet population, in prisons. According to Viktor Semskov, one of the most prominent experts in the field, in 1938, the height of the Yezhovshchina, the Great Terror as it's known in English, there was 1.8 million people in gulags, of which over 80% were regular criminals like thieves, murderers, etc. Comparatively, in the great bastion of democracy and human rights that is the US, there are currently over 2 million prisoners, that we know about at least, the largest prison population on Earth. Even if you were to equalize both ratios and total populations, the amount is roughly equivalent. The only way you could arrive at 18 million is if you counted everyone who ever served a prison sentence ever together in one number, which if applied to the US would result in tens of millions of people, so again it doesn't come off any better. Very disingenuous. Here's some more fun facts. The average imprisonment term in a Gulag center, remember Gulag is an acronym, but I'm not going to get into this or we'll be here all day, was less than 4 years, with a maximum sentence of 10, while in the US, depending on the year, it's more than 5 years, 63 months, with the lowest average modern estimates I've seen being around 3 years. J. Arch Getty's work is excellent as a primer into the Soviet side of this field if you're interested. It goes to show that going to prison anywhere sucks, but this cartoonishly evil and caricatured image of the USSR isn't something anyone honest and actually interested in learning should subscribe to, which betrays their intentions fairly clearly.
Why? Well, the person could have been a criminal, or they could have spoken out against the government.
This is why I don't like doing responses to nonsense like this. She isn't honest, nor does she want to even pretend to be objective. We have actual statistics on this. Again, go actually read the work of experts in this field. I listed one just a minute ago. If you actually cared about political prisoners, and this wasn't just an ideology game to you, you would have mentioned Israeli prisoners, or hell, all the political prisoners that exist in the US, as well as in illegal black sites from Guantanamo to Bangkok. You're a clown.
And that's great for the government because then they get free labor from these prisoners.
Oh, excuse me. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime. Someone isn't aware of their own 13th Amendment. Nearly 1 million people imprisoned making profits for private companies, but no, that's just the market at work. There's nothing wrong here. If she were honest and not a hypocrite, then I'd dignify her nonsense with a proper and nuanced answer, but she doesn't deserve it because this is the level of discourse we're dealing with. Read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander.
We can take a look at the polls and we'll see that over half of Gen Z hate capitalism, distrust the government, and support socialism, which is very funny because how can you simultaneously distrust the government but advocate for socialism? I mean, the whole idea in socialism is that the government is going to regulate everything. They're going to distribute the wealth. They're going to take care of healthcare. How does that work?
Oh boy, she said it. Socialism is when the government does stuff.
And it's more socialism the more stuff it does. And if it does a real lot of stuff, it's communism.
God, this weird smug Karen light tone in her voice is really irritating. That aside though, distrusting the current US government, but not the concept of government in general, isn't a difficult concept to grasp. Well, maybe for this person it might be. The poor thing still thinks the market holds the solution. She also doesn't understand the difference between socialism and social democracy, much like many of those polled, I would assume, which again is another symptom of the intentional inadequacy of the American educational system.
But before we get into this, guys, please make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell so that you don't miss my videos.
You heard her. Can this person be any more of a synthetic grifter channel? Jesus Christ. Anyways, I'll skip to only the things I want to comment on. I'm suffering enough. I don't need to see TikToks on top of this.
Some people might say, oh, we have welfare. Welfare just promotes lazy people.
I actually agree with him there.
Oh god, what an unlikable human being. said like someone who's never known any economic deprivation. This only needs to be said once. The research is overwhelming in how wrong you are. It is empirically proven that the wholly inadequate system of welfare doesn't make people lazy, whatever the fuck that means. In fact, it does the opposite by allowing people the breathing room to find long-term employment or the necessary training for long-term employment. You're just wrong, plain and simple.
And a lot of these Gen Z people are into communism because they hate capitalism. Capitalism is so very evil, and it's the root cause of every issue that you experience. And I thought we would take a look at some of these TikToks explaining why that is.
Alright, Habibi, lose the snarky tone and hyperbole. As mentioned before, capitalism and its ideological propagandists at every level promises a certain thing. Young people are seeing something completely different, and people like you gaslight them into thinking no, actually everything is fine as the biome collapses around us. Literally the "this is fine" picture. I wonder if she's a climate change denier actually. If she isn't, how does she rationalize it with her blatant pro-capitalist stance? I might be expecting a little more than she can offer now that I think about it. Anywho, it's fine to disagree, but don't pretend like you don't see where they're coming from. Why do people make me watch this garbage? Fuck, I'm only 3 minutes in. By the way, before anybody mentions it, I'm only returning the same energy she's outputting through this video.
That's so funny that you're saying you're going to be a slave to capitalism, but you wouldn't be a slave in a communist society or a socialist society because communism can't actually be achieved. But let's talk about that.
Alright, Chairman Petrov here at least believes socialism is possible, which is a start. Define socialism. Define communism. Oh wait, you're a Philistine that talks out of your ass. You seem to think government does stuff is socialism, as you've so eloquently shown earlier. I'm sure she has some riveting and novel theoretical additions to this field of study as vast as all the oceans combined. But joking aside, if you don't actually have at least a minor level of education on a topic, or anything meaningful to say, what's the point of this video? Let's have a listen.
Take a look at your job, for example. In a capitalist society, you have the choice to pick a career.
Terms and conditions apply. Firstly, many children around the world working in sweatshops aren't allowed to pick whatever career because of systemic underdevelopment imposed on their countries in order to maintain them as sources of cheap labor and raw materials. Read The Wealth of Some Nations by Zach Cope. Read Samir Amin's work. Read up on the concept of value transference. Do the smallest modicum of research, I beg you. Even in the richest country on earth, the US, many people simply can't afford the tuition necessary in order to get the education necessary for whatever career they like. Add on to this institutionalized bias against minorities, reproduced cycles of poverty, and 1,000 other factors, and you realize this is just nonsense. Those of wealthier backgrounds have a massive advantage in every regard in this case, from private tutoring and private schooling to legacy admissions, bribery camouflaged as donations, nepotism in employment, the list goes on and on. It takes real skill to be this confident while wrong.
And if you were in a socialist society, you wouldn't have that choice. If you were back in the Soviet Union, right, they would tell you what job you're doing. There's no discussion.
Source? No, really. Source? This is unironically just lying. I knew this was bullshit, but I went out of my way to scour the most anti-communist sources. Maybe I missed something. And even they don't bother reproducing this claim because it's just such obvious nonsense. In the USSR, you picked what to study, and worked in fields relevant to your education, unless she wants to claim the Soviet government chose your uni degree for you. Your job wasn't ordered to you by the central plan or some nonsense. Honestly, this is all that's necessary to know you shouldn't be listening to this person. Ignorance I can forgive, but intentional deceit is another thing entirely.
You go to school for free, they pay for that, but then you have to repay them, not with money, but by listening to them and obeying and doing what they ask you to.
Because you're not told to listen and obey in the US, right? No, not at all. The Patriot Act? What's that? The NSA? Never heard of it. Five Eyes? Doesn't exist. Consent is never manufactured. What could you possibly be talking about? Jesus Christ, imagine being this fucking deluded.
So for example, if there's a shortage of doctors in Siberia, guess where you're going? You're going to be a doctor in Siberia. And until that debt is paid off, maybe that's 5 years, maybe that's 7 years, you're not coming back home.
This is such a silly and dishonest point. She's lying again, by the way, but you should come to expect that at this point. Some countries, like Cuba, for example, have a system in which you're supposed to be a doctor in an underserved area for 2 years or so after you graduate, an objectively good thing. Otherwise, under capitalism, doctors go to where all the money is, and fuck all the rest. That's why, for example, 70% of Malawi's doctors work outside of Malawi. The US currently is plagued with the underserved population problem itself, and that's leaving aside that people can't even, or refuse to, go to a doctor in the first place. Regardless, the USSR had a parallel system to Cuba, but it wasn't like, oh, go to Siberia for 15 years or some other arbitrary amount of time. By the way, there is civilization in Siberia, you do know that, right? Regardless, you finished med school, you did residency, you had a short placement limited to 3 years in the USSR, not 15, 10, 7, whatever the fuck she said. With this placement being somewhere in your country that covers 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, then you went wherever you liked afterwards. If you went somewhere highly rural or distant, for example, Siberia, then you got extra allowances, pay, bonuses, and other benefits. In the US, you have to spend hundreds of thousands just to be able to attend medical school, and after, or if you can even afford to finish, you have to spend the next 30 years minimum paying off that loan. I think serving your country by doing 2 years in an underserved area is a better and more moral deal, wouldn't you think? No, to this person, freedom is paying off medical education loans for 5 years, only to even more than the original amount afterwards because of ridiculous interest rates, a condition several of my colleagues are in, by the way. Fun fact, in 1966, more than 1/5 of all doctors that existed on Earth were in the USSR. And that's with lower salaries, mandatory placements, and other issues with the Soviet healthcare system at the time. They still became doctors, and had more doctors than any other nation. Seems like money isn't the only possible motivator. Who would have thunk? God forbid you want to contribute to society. But no, brain rot Betty over here seems to think that if you're not earning, it's not productive or positive. By the way, in researching this, I found out that Soviet doctors worked, on average, 33 hours a week, and only 1 night a month on call for emergencies, with a normal working week in the USSR being 36 hours otherwise. My experience in my capitalist country as a doctor is very, very different, and far worse from that, I promise you.
There's no free enterprise, right? In the Soviet Union, for example, if you even attempted to do that, you would be sent to a labor camp. Let's continue.
It's impressive how confident she is when so blatantly wrong. There was no framework for starting your own business in the USSR, hence it was literally impossible for you to go to prison for it, short of black market activity, which gets you a prison sentence even in the US, by the way. Furthermore, starting your own business is prohibitively difficult under capitalism. The vast majority of Americans don't have anywhere near the amount necessary as starting capital, and would have immense difficulty qualifying for a business loan. Even if they manage to start, the vast majority, 90%, of startups fail miserably. Add on top of this ethnic and gender discrimination, which is rife, and you get an image of the myth that is the small business entrepreneur, which, by the way, capitalist development intentionally hinders. See my video on centralization of capital for more.
Like many young adults, I used to think that my goal in life was to be happy and healthy. That is until I discovered capitalism. Now, my only goal is to constantly prove my worth to other people. With capitalism, my self-worth is directly tied to my productivity, and so I have transcended from just a human being to a human doing.
Just a human being? Is your worth not in your productivity? Where is your worth coming from then?
The more I look at this person, the more I think it's some kind of demon. Before Beelzebub talks down to anybody about productivity, I'm an emergency ward physician in a central hospital. I'm more productive in 1 day than this person is in their entire month, and that's me being generous. Let me tell you, your sense of self-worth or anything else shouldn't come from your productivity in some bullshit corporate job that won't hesitate to throw you out to maintain bonuses for their board members. Capitalists will take your passion for something and use it to overwork you and underpay you until you lose that passion and become a husk of your former self. Find meaning in community, your off-time activities, your social responsibilities, for example, being a parent, a hobby, literally anything else. No one will lay on their deathbed thinking, boy, was I glad to have been so productive at that administrative advertising firm. It's plainly obvious this person has never really worked a real job.
Sitting at home, sipping your iced latte that you were able to buy because of a job, presumably, or money from your parents, probably more likely in this case. But what do you mean? Where's your worth going to come from then? I mean, seriously, where are you going to get fulfillment if not a job? Are you just do you want to just sit at home all day? What are you talking about?
God forbid they have any minute pleasure in life. If you're not slaving away at some soulless corporate hellscape, you're useless to society. Very rich to claim money from parents, by the way, when she's the spitting image of that, no? Also, again, literal brain rot. I'm diagnosing it right now. Either that or such misaligned perception of what the real world is like. I'm not even gonna bother. Her delusions speak for themselves, honestly, at this point.
Amazing. Capitalism is not just an...
That was not a human reaction to anything I've ever seen. Was she trying to be sarcastic? What was that, genuinely? In the end, she reads out a bit of pretty dodgy Russian pronunciation, but never once brings up the, oh, my family escaped from the USSR, blah blah, most likely because, if her family was ever even from the USSR, they were either the they took our slaves and ponies types, or of the criminal post-USSR state property thieving types. Even if they were in the middle, I don't care for your bullshit anecdotal evidence. My family has tons of people who lived, worked, and were enamored by the USSR. For every negative, there is a positive. But in reality, the vast majority of post-Soviet people preferred the socialist system, unsurprisingly and to her dismay. Alright, that's all I can stomach. I've gone physically sick from staring at this person's face now. And I'm only 5 minutes in. It only took 5 minutes to clearly show this person not only is disingenuous, but is actively lying through her teeth in complete audacity, and she doesn't even have a single issue with it. Wanna know why? Because she's an ideologue, probably of a certain class background where these perspectives are directly in her favor. She doesn't care for the truth, she just wants her side to be right no matter what the facts state. Maybe in the future she'll see the light, that's all we can hope for. The rest of the video is more the same: blanket statements, intentional misrepresentation of what people are saying, and generic outrage, all of it not sourced, obviously. If people really want me to do the rest, then let me know, but it will take a lot of convincing, I can tell you that much. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, it really does help.